44 hours before the freeze hit Calhoun County, Cassie Dern was on her knees in the mud, bleeding from her shoulder, with 8 mechanical engines screaming behind her and a wall of stone between her and everything she had left. But that comes later. First, you need to understand what a Tuesday morning looks like when your father is 3 days in the ground and the bank has already sent someone to take photographs of the equipment. Roy Dern was buried on a Thursday. The man from First Central Agricultural Bank arrived the following Monday. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the property with a clipboard and a camera, photographing the combine, the grain cart, the fuel tanks, the irrigation pump. He photographed the barn. He photographed the house. His eyes went everywhere on the property except to her face. Cassie stood on the porch in her father's old canvas work jacket and watched him move through the yard like he was taking inventory of a warehouse. When he finally walked back to his car, he paused at the gate and said, without turning around, "The note will be accelerated if the next payment is not received within 30 days. She stayed on that porch until his car disappeared down the county road. Then she went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of papers her father had left behind. Not a will. Exactly. Roy Dern was not a man who believed in lawyers. What he left was a green metal box, the kind hardware stores sold in the 1970s for storing receipts. And inside it were 40 years of records. Every payment he had ever made to First Central Agricultural Bank, every repair bill, every fuel receipt, every yield report written in his careful, slanted hand on lined notebook paper, dated and totaled. Roy Dern had kept records the way some men keep faith, without being asked, without expecting anyone to notice. She sat at that table for a long time. Cassie was 26 years old. She had no college degree. She had $1,400 in a checking account her father had never known about, money set aside from 3 summers of working grain elevator shifts on top of the farm work. She had no equipment. First Central had already begun repossessing the financed machinery. The modern Agritech Pro Series tractor Roy had taken a loan on 4 years ago at Philip Slade's strong recommendation. That machine was gone before the funeral flowers wilted. What she had was the land. 380 acres of black Iowa topsoil that her grandfather had broken with a team of horses and her father had spent his entire life maintaining, and she had 30 days before the bank would begin proceedings to take that too. She opened the box and started reading. Roy had a system. Every entry was cross-referenced with a date and a dollar amount. Every debt matched to a payment. Every payment matched to a receipt. He had written the account number of every transaction in the margin in red ink because he did not trust that the bank's records would always match his own. He had been doing this since 1984, 40 years of meticulous, analog certainty. She read until 2 in the morning, then she made a pot of coffee and kept reading. By the time the sun came up, she had found 3 things that mattered. The first was a mortgage payment from 2019 that First Central had recorded as late, but that Roy's receipt, stapled neatly to the corresponding page, showed had been made 4 days before the deadline. The second was a property tax credit from 2021 that the county had never applied to the account balance. The third was a covenant in the original mortgage agreement, buried in paragraph 11 of the fine print, requiring the borrower to maintain agricultural equipment that met current EPA emission standards. That third item did not mean anything to her yet. She set it aside and thought about the first 2. Then she thought about what she needed to get through the harvest. The Henderson Estate auction was listed in the Calhoun County Agricultural Register on a Wednesday morning, 6 days after Roy Dern's funeral. It occupied 3 column inches in the back of the paper, between an advertisement for a seed supplier and a notice about a road closure on Highway 30. She read it twice. Raymond Henderson had farmed 800 acres on the eastern ridge of the county from 1961 until 2001, when a series of strokes had taken his ability to work and eventually his ability to manage his affairs. His land had been sold in pieces over the years, parceled out to larger operations until what remained was the farmstead itself, the house, the outbuildings, and whatever equipment had been sitting in the fields and along the fence lines since Henderson had walked away from it all. The listing described the equipment as 12 vintage tractors, pre-1990, various makes and conditions, sold as a single lot. She drove out to the Henderson property on Thursday afternoon to look at them. Parking on the county road, she walked the fence line on foot. The machines were arranged in a rough row along the western edge of the property, half swallowed by 20 years of blackberry cane and volunteer elm. She counted them from the road. An Oliver 1755 with both rear tires flat and the exhaust stack rusted to a nub. Two Massey Ferguson 1100s, one missing its hood entirely, the other with a cracked block visible from 20 feet away. Three Alice Chalmers 1900s in varying states of dissolution. A handful of smaller utility machines she could not immediately identify under the vegetation. She did not look at them the way the other farmers would look at them. Roy's daughter did not see junk. She saw a specific thing, something she had been thinking about for the past 6 days while reading through her father's records and considering what the modern equipment market had done to independent farmers in the past 4 years. Every one of those machines predated electronic control units. Every one of them ran on air, fuel, compression, and mechanical timing. There was no software. There was no proprietary diagnostic system. There was no corporation that could send a firmware update and lock the engine into a fault mode in the middle of the harvest. Purely mechanical. And in Calhoun County in September, that was worth more than it looked. She called Walt Briggs from the county road. Walt had worked alongside Roy Dern for 31 years. He had rebuilt 3 engines in the Dern barn, helped Roy pour a concrete floor in the equipment shed, and driven Roy to the hospital the morning of the stroke that would eventually kill him. 71 years old, his left knee replaced twice. He could still read a diesel engine by sound the way a musician reads sheet music. She did not call to ask his opinion. She called to tell him what she was going to do and to ask if he would help. Briggs was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "Which ones are you looking at?" She told him. Oliver 1755, the Massey Ferguson 1100 that still had its hood, the 3 Alice Chalmers 1900s. Another silence. "Your daddy would have done the same thing." Walt said, "No, I will be at the auction." The morning of the Henderson estate sale was clear and dry. Farmers came in from 3 counties. Dealers came from Des Moines. A pair of men in collared shirts and leather shoes who were clearly not farmers stood near the equipment shed taking notes on tablets. Grant Holloway arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows and parked it where everyone could see it. Holloway was 54 years old and controlled approximately 12,000 acres in Calhoun and 2 adjacent counties through his operation, Holloway Grain and Ag Corp. He was not a farmer. He was a manager of agricultural assets, which was the phrase he used in county commissioner meetings and bank presentations. He wore a polo shirt to the auction that probably cost more than her truck payment. Cassie registered her bidder number and stood near the back of the crowd. Philip Slade found her before the bidding started. Slade was the regional sales director for Agritech Pro, the equipment manufacturer whose financing agreements had become the dominant force in Calhoun County equipment purchases over the past 6 years. Mid-40s, and he smiled the way men smile when they have already decided they are the smartest person present. He handed her a business card without being asked. "I heard about your father." Slade said, "Terrible loss. Roy was a good man. If you are thinking about getting the operation back on its feet, we have some very competitive financing on the new series." She looked at the card and put it in her jacket pocket without responding. Something behind Slade's eyes recalibrated. He moved on. The auction ran through the morning. The good equipment went fast. A late model grain cart sold in 4 minutes. A functioning sprayer brought $17,000 from a syndicate buyer. By 11 o'clock, the useful machinery was gone and the crowd had thinned considerably. Jim Cleary, The auctioneer mopped his forehead with a bandana and gestured toward the fence line. Lot 42, he said. 12 vintage tractors, pre-1990, mixed makes, as is condition. Sitting since Henderson walked away in 2001, selling as a single scrap lot. Do I hear 2,000? Silence. Holloway laughed from where he stood near his SUV. Not a quiet laugh, the kind designed to be heard across a crowd. Jim, he called out, I will give you $50 to have them towed to the recycler. Save us all the trouble. The crowd laughed with him. A couple of the dealer representatives smiled into their coffee cups. One of the men in collared shirts made a note on his tablet. Do I hear 1,000? Cleary said. Adjusting, she raised her bidder card. 1,000. The laughter shifted into something uncertain. The specific sound that happens when something unexpected occurs and people are not yet sure whether to be amused or uncomfortable. Holloway lowered his sunglasses and looked at her directly for the first time. Honey, he said, his voice carrying the warm condescension of a man who believed he was being generous. You cannot plant soybeans with tetanus. Let the bank handle your daddy's place. Do not waste whatever you have left on Henderson's scrap heap. Her eyes stayed on the auctioneer. 1,000, she said again. A local scrap dealer named Gordon Weaver bid 1,200. She looked at him, a heavy-set man with a decent face, and when he saw what was in her expression, he stepped back and shook his head slightly. He did not have the stomach for it. 1,200, she said. Going once. Cleary called. Going twice. Sold to Cassie Dern for $1,200. She walked to the clerk's table to sign the paperwork. The whispers followed her in the way whispers do when people are not trying very hard to be quiet. She just bought herself a graveyard. Roy's girl has lost her mind. Poor thing. She should have taken the bank's offer on the land when they made it last month. Slade intercepted her at the clerk's table. His smile was back, carefully arranged. Miss Dern, he said quietly, when you are ready to talk seriously about the operation, the offer stands. We can structure something that works. She signed the receipt without looking at him. When she was done, she folded her copy and put it in the same pocket as his business card. Then she went to find Walt. Briggs was already at the fence line, moving down the row with his hands in his pockets and his head down, pausing at each machine long enough to form an opinion. He did not say anything until he had walked the entire row. Then he turned and said, The 1,100 with the hood. That is your best candidate. The block looks intact. The injection pump housing is not cracked. The timing gear cover is corroded but not compromised. She nodded. What about the Oliver? He shook his head slowly. Sleeved bores are seized. We could free them, but it would cost more than the machine is worth as a runner. Use it for parts. And the Alice Chalmers units. 2 of them are parts machines for certain. The third one, the one on the far end, has potential. The hydraulic pump looks like it was serviced sometime in the 90s. Someone cared about that one before they stopped caring. They arranged transport over the next 3 days. It cost her more than she wanted in borrowed time and borrowed favors, recruiting 2 neighboring farm kids with flatbeds to move the machines down the county road in a series of slow, grinding hauls. The tractors went onto the Dern property one by one and lined up in the barn like a small army waiting for orders. The barn had been Roy's domain for 40 years. It still smelled like him. Diesel and bar soap and the particular dust that accumulates on wooden shelves when someone has been pulling the same cans and boxes from the same spots for decades. She stood in the center of it the first night and looked at the row of machines and felt the weight of what she had done. $1,400, the last of it. She picked up a flashlight and started with the Massey Ferguson 1100. Walt arrived at 6 the next morning with his own tools in the bed of his truck and a thermos of black coffee. He set his toolbox down next to the Massey, poured 2 cups, handed one over, and got to work. They established a rhythm over the first week that had the quality of something practiced. Briggs diagnosed and directed. Cassie executed. She had been doing mechanical work beside Roy since she was 9 years old, not as a curiosity, but as a necessity, because her father could not afford to pay someone to do what his hands and his daughter's hands could do together. She knew how to read a compression test. She knew how diesel injection timing worked on a mechanical pump. She knew how to feel the difference between a seized component and one that was simply reluctant after years of disuse. What she did not know, Walt taught her without making a ceremony of it. He explained once, clearly, and then expected her to do it correctly the next time. This was how Roy had learned from his own father. This was how it passed. The barn became their world for the following weeks. They worked 14-hour days in the close warmth of the building, the smell of penetrating oil and metal shavings and old diesel growing so familiar that she stopped noticing it. Her hands stained permanently past the wrists. Her knuckles cracked and bled in the dry air. She wrapped them with electrical tape and kept working. They drained gallons of varnished fuel from the Massey's tank, fuel that had separated and congealed over 20 years into something resembling brown molasses. They flushed the injector lines. They disassembled the injection pump and found its internals surprisingly intact, the precision-machined components preserved inside their housing by the very fuel that had gone bad around them. Walt cleaned each component with the deliberate care of a man who understood that there were no replacement parts available at any price and that these particular pieces of metal had to work or the project was finished. On the 9th day, Briggs found the hatch. He was pulling the seat pan out of the Massey to access a seized adjustment bolt underneath when his pry bar went through the rotted foam and hit something solid beneath the floor plate. He pulled the entire platform up and found a compartment welded into the frame, approximately the size of a shoebox, sealed with a bead of weld done neatly and deliberately. He called her over. They looked at it for a moment. Walt got a cutting wheel and opened it along the weld seam. Inside were 3 items wrapped in oilcloth. The first was a logbook, spiral-bound, its cover water-stained but its pages intact. The second was a folded document sealed inside a waxed paper envelope, the kind that food used to come in before plastic. The third was a separate envelope, smaller, with Henderson's initials written on it in pencil. She opened the logbook first. Raymond Henderson had been meticulous in a way that reminded her immediately of Roy. Every entry was dated, every repair described in detail, parts used, labor time, what failed and why, what the fix cost. The entries ran from 1968 to 1998, 30 years of mechanical history for every machine on the property. Reading it felt like finding the biography of every engine in the barn. She set the logbook aside carefully and opened the smaller envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map on drafting paper, the kind engineers used in the 1970s. A survey drawing of the Henderson property and the surrounding land, dated October 1974, with a red line drawn in ballpoint pen from the eastern corner of the Henderson farmstead southeast through a strip of low woodland and into the rear loading area of the Calhoun County Grain Elevator Complex on the edge of town. Alongside the red line, Henderson had written in his precise hand, private agricultural corridor, registered easement, Calhoun County Deed Book 14-page 312, rail spur right-of-way, Henderson Farm to County Elevator, established 1947. She stared at the map. The rail spur had been decommissioned in the early 1980s when the county expanded Highway 119 and the economics of rail transport changed. The tracks had been pulled up. The corridor had grown over. She had walked through those woods as a child without knowing what they had once been, but the easement was a legal instrument. If it was still registered in the county deed book, the physical land itself, the graded corridor, the right-of-way, still belonged to whoever now held title to it. She set the map carefully on the workbench. Then she opened the waxed paper envelope. The document inside was 12 pages, typed on a manual typewriter, dated March 1989. The header read, Internal Compliance Review, AgriPro Mechanical Division, Confidential. She read the first page, then the second. On the third page, she stopped and read a particular paragraph 3 times. She did not show it to Walt that night. She folded it back into its waxed paper and put it in Roy's box, which she had brought to the barn and kept on the workbench beside the logbook. She thought about it for a long time while she worked. Then she put it away in the back of her mind and focused on the engine in front of her. The Massey Ferguson 1100 came together slowly and then all at once, the way mechanical things do when every component has been properly attended to. By the 17th day, they had a rebuilt injection pump, cleaned injector nozzles, new fuel lines spliced from stock. They drove to 3 different farm supply stores to piece together, a repacked wheel bearing on the left rear, and a hydraulic system that held pressure for the first time in 2 decades. On the 19th morning, Briggs installed the last connection on the fuel system, stood up, pressed both hands into the small of his back, and said, "Put a battery on it." She connected the terminals. Walt sprayed a measured burst of starting fluid into the intake manifold. He straightened up and looked across the engine at her. She climbed into the cab. The seat was exposed foam and bare metal frame. The glass in the rear window was gone. No radio, no GPS screen, no indicator panel beyond the basic analog gauges. It felt like sitting inside a piece of honest machinery, nothing hidden, nothing mediated by software, just the physical relationship between a human being and controlled combustion. She set the throttle. She turned the key. The starter engaged with a heavy, grinding effort, the engine turning over with the resistance of long disuse. The gauges stayed dark. The sound was labored, a machine pulling against its own inertia. Walt said nothing. She held the key. The engine turned, and then, on a particular revolution that felt different from the ones before it, it caught. One cylinder fired, then a second, then all 6 in rapid succession, and the Massey Ferguson 1100 came alive with a sound that was not delicate and was not polite. It was a working sound, a full-throated mechanical declaration that shook the tools on their hooks and rattled the barn door in its frame and sent a family of starlings out of the rafters in a panicked burst. Briggs took off his cap. She put the tractor in gear and drove it out of the barn. Not slowly. She drove it across the farmyard and through the gate and out onto the front field, dropped the plow attachment salvaged from one of the parts machines, and the Massey hit the September soil and opened it up like it had been waiting for this for 20 years. The furrow was straight. The depth was consistent. The engine did not hesitate. Down on the county road, Holloway's black SUV was passing on his way back from an afternoon meeting. He slowed when he heard the engine sound carrying from the direction of the Dern property. He pulled onto the shoulder and looked across the field. On the crest of the hill, in the late afternoon light, Roy's daughter was driving a 30-year-old tractor that everyone in the county had agreed was dead, and she was making it look effortless. Holloway sat there for a long moment with his window down. Then he reached for his phone. The call went to Philip Slade. Slade listened. Then Slade said he would make some calls of his own. That night, standing at the utility sink, washing grease from her hands, she looked at the 11 remaining machines lined up in the shadows. The Massey was outside cooling in the yard, ticking quietly as the metal contracted. She could still smell the fresh earth it had turned. She thought about Roy, who had kept 40 years of records in that green metal box because he did not trust that anyone else would keep them for him. She thought about the map and the 12 typed pages. She thought about 37 days until the freeze. Then she picked up her flashlight and walked to the Oliver 1755, which Walt had designated as the primary parts source, and began stripping its injection pump for components they would need for the Alice Chalmers rebuild beginning tomorrow morning. She worked until midnight. There was nothing to mark the moment with. The machines were still dead. The land was still in debt. The harvest was still coming. Roy Dern's daughter did not need anyone to believe in what she was doing. She needed the engines to run. By the end of the 3rd week, 6 machines were running. Not perfectly. Not quietly. The Oliver Parts donor had given up its injection pump and two good injector sets. And the first Alice Chalmers 19 now idled with the low rumble of a rebuilt engine finding its rhythm. The second Alice had required a fabricated exhaust manifold gasket, which Walt had cut from sheet copper, using a pattern traced directly from the original, a process that took 4 hours and produced something that held pressure on the first test. The third remained on blocks, its transmission stripped to the planetary gears, waiting on a thrust washer sourced from a retired implement dealer in Ames who still kept a warehouse of obsolete inventory organized by decade. Word travels in farming communities the way water travels through clay. It follows the path of least resistance, and it goes everywhere eventually. By the fourth morning after the Massey first turned a furrow, Henry Pickett called from two properties north. His Agritech Pro Series 8 had thrown a fault code 3 days earlier, and the diagnostic screen showed a DEF sensor malfunction that the machine's computer treated as a critical failure, dropping engine power to 15% and making the tractor functionally useless for heavy field work. The dealership had a technician available in 11 days. Henry had beans ready to come out. He called because he had seen the Massey running from his fence line, and because 11 days might as well be 11 years when the calendar is working against you. She leased him the Massey for $280 a day. 4 machines were leased out by the end of that week. The calls came without any advertising. They came because farmers talk, and because the DEF sensor failures that Slade's company had been quietly managing since a flawed firmware update in early August had now cascaded into something that could not be quietly managed anymore. Across Calhoun County and the 2 counties adjacent, modern precision agriculture equipment was sitting dead in fields while crops waited. The irony was not lost on anyone. The machines that cost $400,000 and required satellite connectivity to operate were paperweights. The machines bought for $1,200 and rebuilt with hand tools and sourced parts were working 18-hour days. The barn transformed. Walt recruited 2 retired mechanics from the VFW hall in town, men named Gerald Holt and Denny Carver, who arrived one morning with their own toolboxes and thermoses and asked no questions about compensation. Gerald was 68 and had spent 20 years as a diesel technician for the county road department before retiring. Denny was 72 and had bad hearing in his right ear from decades of engine noise, but his hands moved around an injection pump with a precision that made her stop and watch sometimes without meaning to. They established shifts. Briggs and Cassie took the machines from dead to operational. Gerald and Denny handled maintenance and field repairs on the leased units, driving between farms in Gerald's truck with a portable toolbox in the bed. The lease income hit her account in daily increments that felt unreal after months of watching the balance decline. She did not spend it. She converted it immediately into parts inventory, fuel stock, and the property tax credit she had identified in Roy's records, which she submitted to the county assessor's office with a formal written request for correction and a copy of the relevant payment documentation. The assessor's office acknowledged receipt and said they would review it. She filed it in the box and kept working. It was Pete Fowler who changed things, though not in the way he intended. Fowler farmed 520 acres on the southern border of the Dern property, 58 years old, a third-generation farmer whose operation ran on borrowed equipment financing and the particular optimism that keeps independent farmers functioning in an industry designed to eliminate them. He and Roy had shared a fence line for 19 years, helping each other with equipment and labor during planting and harvest in the way neighboring farmers do. Not because they were close friends, but because the land required it. Pete had 2 Agritech Pro machines locked in fault mode and a grain cart that needed a heavy puller to move loaded. He came to the barn on a Wednesday morning and stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands. She leased him the second Alice Chalmers. What she did not know was that Fowler had received a different visitor the night before. Grant Holloway's operation manager, a man named Curtis Webb, had driven out to Pete's farmhouse at 8 in the evening and sat at his kitchen table and explained the situation in terms that were clear and practical. Holloway Grain would purchase a 1-year extension on Pete's operating loan, effectively removing the pressure of the November payment that had been keeping him awake since August. In exchange, Fowler would provide Webb with a weekly summary of which farms were leasing equipment from Cassie Dern, what the lease rates were, and whether there were any mechanical failures or complaints. Pete had 3 kids. 2 of them were still in the county. His November payment was $63,000 he did not have. He signed the paper Webb put in front of him. He knew what he was doing. That was the part he could not stop thinking about afterward. He drove to the Dern barn the next morning and leased the Alice and worked it in his east field all day without looking toward the farmhouse when he was near enough to see it. That evening, he sent Webb a list of 6 farm names. Meanwhile, inside the barn, Walt and Cassie were pulling the cylinder head off the 6th machine, a Massey Ferguson 1100 with a cracked injector sleeve that Briggs believed could be bored back to spec if they found the right tooling. The day had a quality of momentum, the kind that comes when a plan that seemed impossible is proving itself possible inch by inch. And she was allowing herself something close to optimism for the first time since Roy's funeral. Then Philip Slade drove into the yard. He parked his company truck near the barn entrance and walked in wearing clean clothes and carrying a leather portfolio, standing at the edge of the workspace and looking at the row of machines with an expression she could not immediately classify. He said he wanted to talk about the future. Briggs straightened up from the cylinder head and looked at Slade without speaking. Gerald, nearby cleaning injectors, set his work down and waited. Slade explained that Agritech Pro was prepared to offer a preferred financing arrangement on 2 new units, the kind with a service contract and a guaranteed technician response window of 48 hours. He said the company recognized that the firmware situation had created hardship and they wanted to be part of the solution. He said all of this in the tone of a man doing someone a favor. She was wiping her hands on a shop rag when he finished. She asked him one question. She asked how long Agritech Pro had known about the DEF sensor failure before pushing the firmware update. Something behind Slade's expression shifted without showing in his face. He said the firmware update had gone through standard testing protocols. She nodded slowly. She said she appreciated him coming out, that she was not interested in the financing arrangement, and that he was welcome to leave the same way he came in. Slade stood for a moment with the portfolio at his side. Then he said, "Miss Dern, this is a hard business. Do not make it harder on yourself than it needs to be." Walt looked up from the cylinder head. "Son," Briggs said quietly, "she did not ask for your assessment of her situation. She asked you to leave." Slade left. Walt watched the entrance for a moment after the truck pulled out. Then he found his wrench and went back to the cylinder head as if the interruption had not occurred. That night, she opened the box and took out the waxed paper envelope. She read the 12-page document again, more carefully, with a highlighter from Roy's desk drawer. The document was an internal compliance review conducted by AgriPro Mechanical Division in March of 1989, assessing a known defect in the mechanical fuel injection timing components on a specific product line. The review concluded that the defect was within acceptable tolerance ranges for the era and did not recommend a recall. It also noted that the failure pattern, under specific operating conditions, could produce results consistent with operator error, which would shift warranty liability. The document was 35 years old. The company had changed its name twice since then, but corporate identity in legal terms is a chain of succession, and the liability attached to a document like this did not simply dissolve with a rebranding. She did not know enough law to understand what she had, but she understood enough to know it was significant. She put the document back in the envelope back in the box back under the workbench. She would figure out what to do with it when the harvest was in. The call from Morton Vance at First Central Agricultural Bank came on a Thursday morning, 36 days after the auction. She was in the field on the running Massey, pulling a grain cart for a neighboring farmer, when her phone vibrated in her jacket pocket. She let it go to voicemail. When she stopped to refuel at noon, she listened. Vance's voice was smooth and measured, practiced in the delivery of bad news that sounded like reasonable procedure. He said there was a matter regarding the Dern agricultural mortgage requiring her immediate attention and that it would be in her interest to come in promptly. She called him back from the fuel tank. He said the bank had conducted a routine review of mortgage covenant compliance, specifically Section 4, Paragraph 11, the clause requiring the borrower to maintain agricultural equipment meeting current EPA emission standards. The bank's assessment was that operating pre-EPA compliant mechanical equipment as the primary farm power source constituted a covenant violation. The covenant violation triggered the acceleration clause. The full outstanding balance of $460,000 was due within 7 days. She stood at the fuel tank with the phone against her ear and the Iowa wind moving across the field and said nothing for a moment. Then she asked him to repeat the paragraph reference. Section 4, Paragraph 11. Vance said. She thanked him and ended the call. A crow crossed the field low and fast, heading toward the tree line on the eastern edge of the property. The Massey ticked as it cooled. She had read that paragraph. She had read it 6 weeks ago at Roy's kitchen table at 2 a.m. and noted it in the margin and set it aside because she did not yet understand what it meant. Now she understood exactly what it meant. She drove back to the barn and told Walt. Briggs stood with his arms folded and said nothing for a long moment. His jaw moved once, the way it did when the thinking was unpleasant. They are using your own machines against you, he said. Yes. 7 days. Yes. Then he said, who do you know that knows property law? She thought about Dana Mercer. She had known the name for 3 years without knowing the woman personally. Mercer ran a one-person legal practice out of a converted storefront in Rockwell City, 22 miles east. 2 contested land cases in the county that she knew of, both involving covenant interpretation disputes with lending institutions. Both won. Approximately 50 years old. A reputation for being precise and relentless and not particularly interested in cases that did not matter. Roy had mentioned her once, in the context of a neighbor's foreclosure dispute, and said that woman fights like she has something personal against whoever is on the other side. She called her. Dana Mercer answered on the second ring. Cassie explained the situation in 8 minutes, starting with the auction and ending with Vance's call. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, do you have documentation of every lease transaction since you began operating the fleet? Yes. And your father's original mortgage documents, including the full covenant section? Yes. What else do you have? She thought about Roy's box under the workbench. She said, I have some other things that might be relevant. I would rather show you in person. Dana said she would be at the Dern property at 7 the next morning. She arrived at 6:45. Cassie showed her the box first, then the logbook, the map, and the waxed paper envelope. Dana read the 12-page document standing at the workbench in the barn, still in her coat, without sitting down. She read it twice. When she finished the second reading, she set it down carefully and looked across the workbench. Where did you find this? Dana said. In a sealed compartment welded into the frame of one of the machines. Henderson hid it there. We do not know why. Mercer picked up the document again and turned to the 3rd page. She read the highlighted paragraph. Then she said, I need to make some calls. She stepped outside and was on her phone for 40 minutes. Walt and Cassie worked on the cylinder head and did not try to listen. When Dana came back in, she sat down on the parts crate Gerald Holt used as a work stool and looked directly across at Cassie. She explained that she had spent the past 2 years building a civil case on behalf of 37 farming families in 4 Iowa counties who had suffered financial harm as a direct result of Agritech Pro's equipment practices, including the firmware update, the proprietary diagnostic lockout system, and a pattern of covenant language inserted into bank mortgage agreements by lenders who had financial relationships with Agritech Pro's parent company. The case needed a specific kind of anchor. A documented instance of the company having prior knowledge of systemic defects and choosing concealment over disclosure. The 12-page document from 1989 was exactly that anchor. It was not just relevant to this situation, it was the piece that had been missing from the larger case for 18 months. She said the 37 families had pooled their resources into a legal fund. The fund held enough to cover the outstanding mortgage balance and retain enough for court costs, because without the Dern property as part of the case, authenticating the anchor document became legally complicated. If Cassie was willing to participate in the broader case, the fund would pay off the mortgage in full. She looked at Walt. Briggs was looking at the document on the workbench. He said, "Your daddy kept 40 years of records because he knew the day would come when a piece of paper was the only thing standing between this family and someone bigger than them." He picked up his wrench. "Seems like he was right," Walt said. She called Vance the next morning and told him she would be at the bank at 2 in the afternoon. Dana came with her. They walked in together, Cassie in her work clothes and boots, Mercer in her coat with a document case under her arm. Vance met them in his office with the professional sympathy of a man who had already decided how the meeting would end. Holloway was sitting in the chair beside Vance's desk. She had not expected that. She did not show it. He looked at her with the expression of a man watching a foregone conclusion unfold. He was there to witness the debt acceleration and, in all probability, to have a purchase offer ready the moment the default was formalized. He had done this before. He knew the cadence of it. Dana set her document case on Vance's desk and opened it. She placed the payoff check on the desk first, drawn on the legal fund account, made out to First Central Agricultural Bank for the full outstanding balance of $460,000 plus 11 days of additional accrued interest, calculated to the day. Then she placed a second document beside it, a formal legal notice of participation in a pending civil action against Agritech Pro and its affiliated lending partners, including First Central Agricultural Bank, related to coordinated covenant language inserted into agricultural mortgage agreements for the purpose of triggering accelerated default proceedings in coordination with equipment financing interests. Vance looked at the check, then at the notice. His professional sympathy evaporated. Holloway leaned forward. "This is not legitimate," he said. "That clause was written into the standard mortgage template. It has nothing to do with my operation." Dana looked at him for the first time since entering the room. She said, "Your operation manager, Curtis Webb, met with Peter Fowler on the evening of October 2nd and offered a debt extension in exchange for intelligence on the Dern lease operation. We have a signed statement from Mr. Fowler documenting that meeting in detail. If you would like, I can add Holloway grain to the action this afternoon. It would take me approximately 20 minutes." The room was quiet. Outside the bank windows, the main street of Rockwell City moved in its ordinary way. A truck pulled through the intersection. A woman walked a dog on the sidewalk. Vance picked up the payoff check. He said he would need to process the paperwork. Dana said they would wait. 40 minutes later, Cassie walked out of First Central Agricultural Bank with a stamped mortgage release in her hand. The Dern property, 380 acres of black Iowa topsoil, free of debt for the first time in 11 years. Holloway came out behind them and stood on the sidewalk. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past anger into something colder. "You think this is over," he said. She folded the mortgage release and put it in her jacket pocket, the same pocket where she had put Slade's business card at the auction 6 weeks ago. She walked to her truck and drove back to the farm. The freeze forecast came that evening on the county agricultural radio service. The announcer's voice was careful and specific. A cold front originating in Alberta was moving southeast at significant speed. Projected arrival in Calhoun County in 44 hours. Projected low of 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Any unharvested crops in the field at that temperature would sustain complete loss. She stood in the barn doorway with the radio on the workbench behind her and looked at the dark fields. 10 machines running. 2 more could be operational within 36 hours if nothing went wrong. Across the county, the farmers who had leased the fleet were deep into their harvests, making progress that would have been impossible without the mechanical machines. But the grain carts, fully loaded, still needed to reach the elevators. and the only practical route for heavy agricultural equipment from the eastern farmlands to the grain elevator complex ran directly along Highway 119. Her phone rang at 9 that evening. Gerald Holt. Gerald said that Commissioner Dale Corbin had posted an emergency enforcement notice on the County Agricultural Board website at 8:45. Citing Ordinance 42B from 1994, the notice prohibited the operation of any agricultural machinery exceeding 15,000 pounds on county-maintained asphalt unless the equipment was fitted with modern EPA-compliant particulate filtration systems. The mechanical fleet had no such systems. Highway 119 was closed to them. She read the notice on her phone twice and calculated the implications. The dirt roads running parallel to the highway were washed out from spring flooding and could not support the weight of loaded grain carts. The bridge over Shelter Creek on the alternate route had a posted weight limit of 12,000 pounds. The only bridge that could handle the load was on Highway 119. They were not just blocked, they were boxed. She stood in the dark barn for a long moment. Around her, the machine sat silent and patient. The smell of diesel and metal and worked earth so familiar now, it felt like the barn itself was breathing. Then she walked to the workbench and picked up the 1974 survey map that Raymond Henderson had sealed in waxed paper and hidden inside the frame of a machine he never expected anyone to find. She stood under the bare bulb hanging from the center rafter and looked at the red line. The Henderson Corridor, private agricultural right-of-way, registered easement, established 1947, running southeast from the eastern corner of the old Henderson property, now the eastern edge of the Dern land, through approximately 1 mile of second-growth timber and across the stone viaduct over Shelter Creek, emerging at the rear loading area of the Calhoun County Grain Elevator Complex. 1 mile of forest, a stone bridge, 44 hours before the freeze. She called Walt. He answered immediately, which meant he had not been asleep. She told him what the map showed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That viaduct was built in 1931 out of quarried limestone blocks. I know because my grandfather helped pour the drainage channels around the base. That bridge will hold more weight than anything we will ever put on it. And the corridor. The grade is still there," Walt said. "Henderson built that rail bed on compacted limestone fill. Under 30 years of vegetation, that surface is still solid. You would know this if you grew up here, which you did." He paused. "How many machines do we have with front blade attachments?" 4, maybe 5 if we pull the loader bucket off the Big Alice and fabricate a blade mount. 6 hours of work. Call Gerald." Walt said, "Call Denny. Call everyone who has leased a machine and tell them to bring chainsaws and chains and whatever lights they have. Tell them to be at your east gate in 3 hours." He hung up. She stood in the barn with the map in her hand and the freeze coming and 1 mile of dark timber between her and the elevator. She called Gerald. Then she called Dana Mercer. Then she went to find her chainsaw. She had 3 hours to turn a fence line into a staging area and a forest into a road. The east gate of the Dern property opened onto a strip of rough pasture running along the border with the old Henderson land. She drove the Big Alice Chalmers out first, its front loader raised, and parked it facing the tree line. Walt arrived 12 minutes later in his truck with Gerald and Denny in the cab and tools in the bed. They did not waste time on conversation. Gerald went straight to the Alice and began assessing what it would take to mount a blade attachment in place of the bucket. Denny walked the fence line with a flashlight, marking the entry point where the old railbed corridor began. The farmers came in ones and twos over the following hour. Henry Pickett arrived with his son and a chainsaw that sounded like it had been recently sharpened. 2 brothers named Carver from the northern end of the county came in a flatbed loaded with logging chains used for pulling stumps. A woman named May Holden, who had been leasing the second Massey for 10 days and had not missed a payment, came with her husband and 2 portable work lights on telescoping stands that threw broad, flat illumination across the pasture when switched on. By midnight, there were 19 people at the east gate. Dana Mercer arrived at 12:15 with a rolled document under her arm and a thermos of coffee she did not offer to share because she was already on the phone when she got out of her car. She walked to the property line marker, a steel post at the corner where the Dern and Henderson parcels met, and spread the 1974 survey map against her car hood with a flashlight in her teeth. She finished her call and looked over. "The easement is registered," Dana said. "I confirmed it with the county deed records 20 minutes ago. Deed Book 14, page 312, exactly where Henderson wrote it on the map. The right-of-way has never been vacated because no one ever bothered to vacate it. It was just forgotten. Can Corbin stop us?" "Not on this land. The corridor is a private agricultural easement predating the county road system. Corbin's ordinance applies to county-maintained asphalt. We are not going anywhere near county-maintained asphalt. If he sends deputies onto this corridor, I will have a federal injunction filed before they get their boots muddy." She capped her thermos. "I will be at that property line all night," Dana said. "Go build your road." Walt had the blade mount fabricated and bolted to the Alice by 1 in the morning. Not elegant work, steel plate and salvaged mounting hardware, and 4 hours of proper engineering compressed into 50 minutes. But when Gerald Test lowered it against the frozen ground and the blade caught and held, nobody said anything about the aesthetics. They entered the corridor at 1:15. The old rail bed was exactly what Briggs had said it would be. Under 30 years of elm saplings and blackberry cane and accumulated leaf matter, the compacted limestone fill was still there, still graded, still draining correctly at its engineered slope. The Alice hit the first wall of vegetation and pushed through it with the indifference of a machine that weighs more than most houses. Saplings snapped, root masses tore free. Decades of overgrowth that had seemed permanent from the outside simply moved when something heavy enough insisted. Behind the Alice, the chainsaw crews worked the larger trees the blade could not push over. Henry Pickett's boy, 23 years old and cutting timber since he could hold a saw, dropped 3 mature elms in the first 40 minutes with a precision that drew no comment from the older men because it required none. The logs were dragged clear by the machines with logging chains, swung out of the corridor, and stacked at the margins. Cassie drove the Massey behind the Alice, pulling a heavy drag chain that smoothed the disturbed surface behind the blade work. The work lights moved with them, carried forward by May Holden's husband on the flatbed, throwing flat illumination down the lengthening corridor. The cold came down hard after 2 in the morning. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 90 minutes as the front began its advance. Breath plumed in the worklight beams. The ground, which had been yielding under the machines, began to firm as the frost worked into the topsoil. She felt it in her hands first. The steering wheel of the Massey had no cab, no heat, no barrier between her and the air, and her fingers went from cold to aching to something past aching that required concentration to ignore. They had cleared 600 meters by 3 in the morning. The viaduct was 400 meters further. Walt came up on foot alongside the Massey, slower than usual, the cold getting into the joint the way it always did after midnight. He held up his hand and she throttled back. "There is a problem at the bridge," he said. She climbed down and followed him forward along the cleared corridor to where Gerald was standing with a flashlight aimed at the viaduct approach. The bridge itself was intact, exactly as Briggs had described, limestone blocks from the 1930s. The arch spanning Shelter Creek, with the confidence of something built by people who intended it to last. But the southern embankment, the approach from their side, had given way at some point in the past decade. A section of earth approximately 20 feet wide and 8 feet deep had slumped toward the creek, taking the old rail bed surface with it and leaving a gap between the end of the corridor and the bridge deck. "We cannot blade that," Gerald said. "The angle drops too steep toward the water. We push a machine down there. We lose it in the creek." Walt crouched at the edge of the slump and aimed his light down into it. The gap was filled with displaced earth, root masses, and creek-rolled rock. Moving it back to reconstruct the approach grade would take equipment working at angles that risked the machines themselves. Henry Pickett's son walked to the edge and looked down without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "We do not fill it, we bridge it." Everyone looked at him. "We have logging chain, and we have the elm trunks we already cut. We lay the trunks across the gap, parallel to the bridge axis, and chain them to the bridge deck anchors on one side and to the corridor grade pins on the other. It will not be a permanent surface, but it will hold the weight of the machines if we cross one at a time and keep the speed down." Walt stood up and looked at the elm trunks stacked at the corridor margin 200 meters back. "Those elms are 20 inches at the butt," he said. "Green wood, they will hold." He looked at the picket boy. "How long?" "Hour and a half. Maybe less with enough hands." They had 37 hours until the freeze. Walt said, "Do it." They brought the elm trunks forward with the logging chains, dragging them along the cleared corridor in the dark. The work was physical in the way that exhausted people past a certain point and clarified people past a different point, where the mind stops cataloging discomfort and simply executes. She was somewhere in that second territory by 3:30 in the morning, running on coffee and cold air and the focus that comes when there is no margin for error. The trunks were positioned across the gap using the Massey as a crane, logging chains rigged to the drawbar, and the trunks guided by hand into alignment. It took 4 attempts to seat the first trunk correctly because the gap edge kept crumbling under the leverage pressure and the trunk wanted to rotate. On the 5th attempt, with 4 men holding guide ropes in the dark, it seated flush against the bridge deck stone, and Gerald drove a steel spike through a pre-drilled hole into the limestone mortar to pin it. They had 4 trunks across by 5 in the morning. Briggs walked the improvised surface with his flashlight, testing the gaps between trunks, checking chain tension at each anchor point, thorough in a way that cost 20 minutes and was worth more than those 20 minutes. "Single file," Walt said, "second gear, no stopping on the surface." She took the Massey across first. She held second gear and kept the throttle steady and looked at the far side of the bridge deck rather than the gap below. And the elm trunks shifted once, a lateral movement of perhaps 2 inches that sent a cold pulse through her chest, and then the front wheels hit the stone bridge deck and she was across. She stopped on the far side and turned to watch. Walt came next in the Alice, his face expressionless, hands easy on the wheel. Then Gerald in the third machine, then the others, one by one, work lights throwing long shadows back through the corridor as each machine made the crossing. The last machine was the restored Oliver, the one designated a parts donor at the beginning and then reconsidered when all the other machines were running and parts still remained in inventory. Walt had spent 4 separate days getting it functional without telling Cassie why, and she had not asked. It crossed the viaduct at 5:40 with May Holden's husband at the controls, his jaw set, eyes straight ahead. When it was across, Pete Fowler's truck pulled out of the dark at the eastern end of the corridor approach and stopped. She had not heard him arrive. She did not know when he had come or how long he had been there. Fowler got out and stood in the work lights. He looked older than 58 in that light and that cold. His cap was in his hands, and his eyes were on the ground. He did not speak immediately. When he did, he said, "I sent Webb a list of your lessees. 6 names. I am telling you because you will find out, and I would rather you hear it from me." She looked at him without answering. "Holloway offered to cover my November payment. Pete said, 'Oh, I have 3 kids.' I told myself it was not that serious." He stopped. It was that serious. He reached back into his truck bed and lifted out a hydraulic cylinder assembly, still in its manufacturer packaging, the kind used in the steering linkage of the Massey Ferguson 1100, not a cheap part, not something someone bought without planning ahead. He set it on the tailgate. "Your left steering cylinder is weeping at the high-pressure fitting," Fowler said. "I could hear it when you crossed the viaduct. It will fail before you make it another mile in this cold." His eyes stayed on the tailgate when he said it. Walt came over and examined the packaging without touching it. "That is the correct part number," Briggs said. Pete said, I know. How did you know it was the high-pressure fitting? Because I stood at my fence line with binoculars and watched your machines run for 2 weeks. I watched everything. I am a farmer. I watch things. She looked at Fowler for a long moment. She did not forgive him with words. She did not have words for what she felt about what he had done. And she did not perform an emotion she had not finished having. But she looked at the cylinder on the tailgate, and she looked at the man who had brought it here in the dark at 5 in the morning, and she said, Can you do the swap out here? Pete said. I brought a light, Walt said. 20 minutes. 30 if the fittings are corroded. They were corroded. It took 32 minutes. Fowler and Briggs, working on opposite sides of the steering linkage in the beam of Pete's lamp, not talking, their hands moving with the economy of people who have done this kind of work in cold and dark before. She held the lamp steady and watched the corridor behind them where the other machines idled in a line, exhaust rising in the frozen air. When they were done, Walt torqued the final fitting and stood up. He looked at Pete without saying anything. Fowler nodded once and began gathering his tools. He drove his truck alongside the machines for the rest of the night, his headlights supplementing the work lights, his presence neither announced nor acknowledged further. The last 400 meters of corridor were easier than the first 600. The limestone fill was shallower here, the vegetation thinner, and by the time they reached the final stretch, the temperature had dropped to the point where the ground was fully frozen, and the machine tracks did not sink, but rang against the hard surface like iron on iron. They emerged from the tree line at 6:51 in the morning. The rear loading area of the Calhoun County Grain Elevator Complex was a broad concrete apron edged with steel-framed loading bays, empty at that hour except for a single elevator worker who had come in early to prep the scales. He was drinking coffee from a paper cup when the Alice Chalmers came out of the woods, and he stood very still, watching the machine come toward him across the frozen ground with its lights on and its exhaust rising straight in the cold air. Then 8 more machines followed it out of the tree line, then 3 more after that. The elevator worker set his coffee down and went inside to get his supervisor. The supervisor came out and looked at the line of machines. He looked at the tree line. He looked at Walt. Where did you come from? He said. Briggs had climbed down from the Alice and was stretching his bad knee against the side of the machine. The Henderson corridor, Walt said. It has been there since 1947. We just cleared it. The supervisor looked at the machines again, then at the tree line. You cleared a mile of forest overnight. Mile and a quarter, Walt said. The viaduct added some distance. The supervisor shook his head slowly. Then he went back inside and began opening the scale house. They started offloading at 7:15. The grain carts came forward one at a time onto the elevator scales, the bushel weights registering on the digital readout above the scale house window. She sat in the Massey and watched the numbers accumulate and felt something she did not have a word for. Not triumph exactly. Triumph implies surprise. What she felt was closer to the satisfaction of a calculation that has proven correct. The quiet that comes when the numbers running in your head for weeks finally match the numbers in front of you. The freeze hit Calhoun County at 9:47 that morning. It came with wind first, a hard northwest wind that swept the cornfields flat and bent the dry stalks in waves. Then the temperature, holding at 17, dropped to 11 in 20 minutes as the front passed through. The sky went white and then gray, and then the first fine snow began, horizontal in the wind, stinging against exposed skin. Across the county, on the eastern fields where Holloway's operation ran 12,000 acres of late soybeans and corn, the freeze found the crops that had not been harvested. The Agritech Pro machines were still locked in fault mode, their DEF systems crystallized by the cold, their computers throwing cascading error codes that no technician could resolve remotely. The crops they could not reach went into the freeze standing. Holloway was at his operations office in town when his field manager called with the loss estimates. He listened without speaking. The numbers were significant. Unharvested acreage multiplied by current commodity prices produced a figure representing a substantial portion of the season's revenue. Revenue already supporting debt service on the equipment financing Slade's company had structured. He hung up and sat at his desk and looked at nothing. His phone rang again. His attorney. The attorney had received a formal notice from Dana Mercer's office that morning documenting Curtis Webb's meeting with Pete Fowler and its content. The notice indicated this conduct would be included in the civil action being prepared against Agritech Pro and its affiliated corporate partners. Holloway told his attorney he would call him back. The call never came. At the elevator, the offloading continued through the morning and into the afternoon. The independent farmers of Calhoun County brought their grain in across the corridor, machine by machine, cart by cart. The elevator supervisor had called his staff in early and opened all 4 scale lanes. By noon, the loading bays were running continuously, the pneumatic conveyors moving grain into the silos with a sound indistinguishable from the wind. A local radio station sent a reporter with a recorder at 10 in the morning, alerted by the supervisor who had taken a photograph of the machines coming out of the tree line and sent it to his brother-in-law who worked at the station. The reporter was 24 years old and had grown up in Des Moines and had no particular context for what she was looking at, but she had the instinct to recognize that something significant was happening and to record it. She found Cassie at the scale house, checking the weight ticket on the 3rd cart. She asked if she could ask some questions. "I have grain to move," Cassie said. The reporter asked if there was anything she wanted people to know about what had happened. Roy's daughter folded the weight ticket and put it in her pocket. She looked at the reporter for a moment. Then she walked back to the Massey and climbed up and moved the next cart into position. Walt, who had been standing nearby, watched the reporter's expression as the machine pulled away. He said, "She bought 12 machines everyone agreed were dead for $1,200. She rebuilt them with her father's tools. She cleared a mile of forest in one night to get around a blockade. And she did all of it because her father kept 40 years of records in a metal box, because he believed the truth of a thing matters and ought to be preserved." He picked up his thermos from the Alice hood. "You can write that down if you want," Walt said. The reporter wrote it down. The story ran on the Regional Agricultural Network that afternoon and was picked up by 2 state outlets by evening. By the following morning, it had spread across Midwest farming forums and reached national agricultural trade publications within the week. The specific detail that traveled furthest was not the corridor or the viaduct or the frieze. It was the box. Farmers across 4 states understood immediately what it meant and what Roy Dern had understood that most institutions would prefer he had not. The civil action Dana Mercer filed against Agritech Pro and its affiliated partners was consolidated with 2 similar actions in Nebraska and Minnesota by the following spring. The combined filing documented a pattern of conduct across 11 years involving coordinated firmware practices, proprietary diagnostic monopolization, and coordinated covenant language inserted into agricultural mortgage agreements through relationships between the equipment company and regional lenders. The 12-page document from 1989 was entered into evidence as Exhibit A. Agritech Pro's parent company settled 14 months later. The terms were not public in their entirety, but the affected farming families in 4 states received a collective payment that the Des Moines Register described as substantial, and the company agreed to provide open diagnostic access to all equipment sold under proprietary lock agreements for the previous decade. Philip Slade resigned his regional directorship before the settlement was announced. He cited personal reasons. Holloway Grain and Ag Corp. Filed for Chapter 11 reorganization the following February. The combination of crop losses from the freeze, the litigation exposure from the Webb documentation, and the loss of a federal supply contract, quietly suspended pending the civil action, produced a financial position the company's lenders declined to support. The 12,000 acres Holloway had assembled over 15 years were liquidated through the bankruptcy process. Several hundred acres along the Calhoun County border sold at a court-supervised auction in April. Henry Pickett bought 40 acres of that land, Two of the Carver brothers bought 60 between them. Pete Fowler bought 20, which was all he could finance. With a conventional loan from a credit union in Rockwell City that Dana Mercer had helped him arrange. He paid the note on time every month. He never discussed what he had done with Cassie. She never brought it up. They shared a fence line and the practical necessities of neighboring farmers and a careful mutual silence about a night in October that both of them understood differently and neither of them had finished thinking about. Spring came to Calhoun County without asking whether anyone was ready. The frost came out of the ground in stages, the soil loosening from the top down, and the first warm days arrived with the quality of light that belongs only to Iowa in April, flat and bright and coming from everywhere at once. Walt repainted the machines in March. He did it without telling Cassie he was going to do it. She came to the barn one morning and found Briggs standing in front of the first Massey with a spray gun and a compressor he had brought from his own shop, wearing his old canvas coveralls and a respirator pushed up on his forehead. The color was not the original Massey red, not Agritech Pro gray, not the faded chalky finish the machines had worn when they came off the Henderson property. It was a dark red, the specific shade of the barn door that Roy Dern had painted and repainted for 40 years until it had become the color that meant this place, this property, this particular piece of earth on the county road in Calhoun County. She stood in the barn entrance and looked at the first machine in its new color. She did not say anything for a long time. Walt pushed the respirator down over his face and went back to work. She walked to the far end of the barn and looked at the 11 remaining machines waiting their turn, then walked back outside and stood in the April light and looked at the fields. 380 acres, black topsoil, no debt, no covenant, no bank watching the equipment list. Her father's fields, and her grandfather's before that, and the man before him who had broken this ground with horses and called it his because he had made it something from something harder. She went inside and made coffee, and came back out and sat on the porch step and drank it, and listened to the compressor running in the barn, and the birds beginning in the tree line at the eastern edge of the property. The corridor now cleared and graded, and marked with survey posts that Dana had arranged to have placed after the county formally acknowledged the easement status. The corridor was used twice in the spring planting season by neighboring farmers who needed to move equipment to the elevator. She charged no fee. She asked only that users maintain the surface and report any drainage issues directly. The elevator supervisor, Tom Greer, drove out in May to see the viaduct. He stood on the limestone bridge and looked at the elm trunk crossing that Henry Pickett's son had engineered in the dark at 4 a.m, the chains still holding, the trunks gray and weathered but intact. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "I have been running that elevator for 19 years. I have never seen anything come out of those woods before." She thought about telling him the story from the beginning, the auction, the barn, the box, the waxed paper envelope, the 7 days, the night in the corridor with the chainsaws and the work lights, and Pete Fowler's hydraulic cylinder on the tailgate. Instead, she said, "The easement has been there since 1947. We just cleared it." Greer nodded slowly. He said, "Well, I am glad you knew it was there." He drove back to town. She walked the corridor on her way back to the barn, following the cleared grade through the timber. The elm stumps were already throwing new growth, pale green shoots reaching back toward the light. The blackberry canes were returning at the margins. In 10 years, if no one maintained it, the corridor would begin to close again. She made a note to herself to bring a brush mower in July. In the barn, Walt was finishing the last machine, the Oliver that had started as a parts donor and ended as a runner. The dark red was drying on the hood and the fenders, and in the slant of afternoon light coming through the barn door, it looked like the machines had always been that color, and everything before had been temporary. Briggs cleaned his spray gun at the utility sink, the same sink where she had washed her hands on the night the Massey first ran, the same sink Roy had installed in 1987 and plumbed himself and never replaced because it worked. He dried his hands and looked at the row of machines. "Your father would have known what to do with all of this," Walt said. She looked at the machines. He did know. she said. He wrote it all down. Walt put his towel on the hook beside the sink, the hook Roy Dern had put there, and picked up his toolbox. He said he would see her in the morning. He drove home in the last of the April light, down the county road that had carried Roy Dern back and forth for 40 years, past the fields beginning to show the first green of the planting season, past the fence line where Pete Fowler's new 40 acres began, past the sign at the county road junction that said Calhoun County, established 1851, as if the county itself needed to remind people that it had been here long before any of the things that had recently happened to it. In the barn, the machines sat in their new color in the quiet. 12 machines that everyone had agreed were dead, still running.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break me, they were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey, every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason I can rise. the journey to